Good evening, and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. There is a town in the Arizona desert where the dust still remembers the sound of gunfire, where the names carved into wooden grave markers became the raw material of American mythology, and where a 30-second gunfight on a cold October afternoon in 1881 somehow echoed so loudly that we're still talking about it 140 years later. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The desert before the legend, Arizona territory before Tombstone. The story of Tombstone does not begin with silver. It does not begin with Wyatt Earp or Doc Holliday or any of the names that would eventually fill the pages of dime novels and light up cinema screens across the 20th century. It begins, as most stories of consequence do, with the land itself. And the land of southern Arizona is not a gentle place. It never has been. The Sonoran Desert stretches across what is now southern Arizona and northern Mexico, in a vast, shimmering expanse of creosote and ocotillo, of saguaro cactus standing like sentinels against skies so blue they almost look painted. The summers are brutal and indifferent. Temperatures climb past 100 degrees and stay there, baking the red and brown earth until it cracks. Winters bring cold nights that surprise people who assume deserts are always warm. And the monsoon season, arriving in July and August, transforms dry creek beds into roaring rivers in a matter of minutes, then leaves them bone dry again within hours as if nothing had happened. This is a landscape that does not apologize. It has never apologized. It simply exists, vast and indifferent, demanding respect from anyone who presumes to pass through it, let alone build something permanent within it. Long before anyone with a Spanish surname or an Anglo name ever set foot in this corner of the continent, the land was home to peoples who had worked out difficult arrangements, with its demands over centuries and millennia. The Hohokam, whose name in the language of the later Oldham people means something close to those who have gone, built elaborate canal systems across the desert floor as far back as 300 CE. They farmed corn and beans and squash in a landscape that seemed to make agriculture impossible, channeling the precious water of rivers through hand-dug canals that stretched for miles. At their height, around 900 to 1200 CE, their settlements contained thousands of people, and their canal networks were engineering achievements of remarkable sophistication. Then, around 1400 CE, the Hohokam disappeared, not suddenly, not in a single catastrophe, but gradually, dissolving into other identities and other places. Drought is one theory, social collapse is another, a combination of pressures that simply made the old way of living unsustainable. Whatever the reason, they left their canals behind, and the desert slowly reclaimed the edges of what they had built. The people who came to prominence in this region in the centuries that followed were the Apache, and here it is worth pausing for a moment, because the Apache have been so thoroughly mythologized, so relentlessly filtered through the lens of frontier conflict and Hollywood imagery, that it takes some deliberate effort to see them clearly. The Apache were not a monolithic nation. They were a collection of related but distinct groups, including the Chiricahua, the Jicarilla, the Mescalero, and others, each with their own territory, their own leadership structures, and their own particular adaptations to life in the desert southwest. The Chiricahua Apache, whose homeland encompassed much of the area that would later become Cochise County, Arizona, including the mountains and valleys around where Tombstone would eventually be built, were extraordinary people. They were mobile, adaptable, and deeply knowledgeable about every spring and water source in a landscape where water meant survival. They raided extensively, it is true, taking cattle and horses and goods from Spanish and later Mexican settlements to the south and from other tribes. But raiding was not simple banditry in their worldview. It was an economic system, a political tool, and a way of maintaining relationships between groups. The Spanish arrived in the region in the 1500s, pressing northward from Mexico City in a long, slow, frequently disastrous effort to extend their colonial reach. They established missions, most famously the mission at Tumacacori, and later the mission San Xavier del Bac near modern-day Tucson. They brought cattle, horses, and diseases. The diseases, as they did everywhere in the Americas, hit first and hardest, reducing indigenous populations by numbers we still cannot calculate with confidence. Some estimates suggest that populations in some areas declined by 70 or 80%, within a century of sustained contact. The Spanish never truly controlled the Chiricahua heartland. They established presidios, fortified outposts at Tubac and Tucson, and they negotiated, fought, and negotiated again in a complicated and often violent relationship with the various Apache groups. Some periods saw relative peace maintained through gifts and trade arrangements. Other periods erupted into sustained warfare that left both sides exhausted and grieving. Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in 1821, and the territory of what would become Arizona passed to Mexican authority. The Mexican government struggled even more than the Spanish had to maintain any meaningful presence in the far north. Funding for frontier presidios dried up, soldiers went unpaid. Settlers who had cautiously pushed northward during more stable periods retreated southward again. The Apache, freed from the pressure of Spanish military campaigns and the gift-giving policies that had kept some peace, resumed raiding on a significant scale. The 1830s and 40s in the Sonoran borderlands were extraordinarily violent. Apache raids devastated Mexican settlements across Sonora and Chihuahua. The Mexican states offered bounties for Apache scalps, a policy so horrific in its implementation and so counterproductive in its effects that it served mainly to deepen the cycle of violence. American scalp hunters, among the most morally repugnant figures of the era, crossed the border to collect those bounties, sometimes killing peaceful villagers and presenting their scalps as Apache trophies. The whole system was a catastrophe of brutality that served no one except the most cynical economic interests. Into this volatile landscape came the Americans. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 resulted in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which transferred what is now California, Nevada, Utah, and much of the Southwest to the United States. But the southern portion of Arizona, the Gadsden Purchase territory, came later, in 1853 and 1854, when the United States purchased a strip of land from Mexico for $10 million. The stated reason was to secure a southern route for a transcontinental railroad. The actual reason included that plus a general American appetite for territory that characterized the era. The United States Army arrived in Arizona and immediately found itself in the same position the Spanish and Mexicans had occupied. It controlled the towns and the roads and very little else. The Chiricahua Apache, under leaders of extraordinary capability, including eventually Cochise and later Geronimo, contested American authority in the mountains and valleys they had always inhabited. The Apache Wars, which began in earnest in the early 1860s and continued in various forms until Geronimo's final surrender in 1886, formed the violent background against which Tombstone's entire history played out. And this is important context, not just as historical background dressing, but as a real and ongoing reality for the people who lived in southern Arizona during the Tombstone era. When prospectors like Ed Schieffelin ventured into the hills south of the San Pedro River in the late 1870s, they were doing so in territory where Apache raids were a genuine and immediate danger. When ranchers in the area complained about losing cattle, some of those cattle were lost to Apache raiders as well as to human rustlers. The frontier violence that Tombstone is famous for existed within a larger landscape of violence that is sometimes conveniently forgotten in the romantic retelling. The San Pedro River Valley, where Tombstone would eventually rise, was a corridor of relative fertility in the surrounding desert. The river itself, flowing north, provided water and riparian habitat, cottonwood trees and willows lining its banks in a strip of green that drew animals and the people who hunted them. Mexican ranchers had worked this valley before the Americans arrived, and some had been there for generations. Camp Huachuca, later Fort Huachuca, established in 1877, represented the American military's effort to provide some protection in the region and to create a base for operations against the Chiricahua. It was into this landscape, ancient and contested and raw, that a scruffy, stubborn prospector named Ed Schieffelin walked in 1877 with a pick and the particular kind of optimism that looks indistinguishable from foolishness until the moment it is vindicated. The desert did not welcome him. The desert does not welcome anyone. It simply waits to see what you are made of. Ed Schieffelin and the Silver Strike, how a dream became a boomtown. You have to have a certain kind of person to go looking for silver in a desert where people are actively trying to kill you. Not a reckless person exactly, although Ed Schieffelin certainly had his reckless tendencies. More a person with a very specific relationship to probability, one in which the possibility of reward so thoroughly dominates consciousness that the probability of catastrophe simply does not register with appropriate weight. Ed Schieffelin was 30 years old in 1877. He had been prospecting for most of his adult life, wandering the mountains and deserts of the American West in the classic pattern of the mineral seeker, always convinced that the big strike was just over the next ridge. He had found some silver and some gold over the years, enough to keep him going, not enough to make him rich. He was a physically distinctive figure, tall and lean, with long dark hair and a beard that he apparently paid very little attention to, dressed in clothes that were described by contemporaries as being roughly equivalent in quality to what you might find discarded by a scarecrow. He was, by most accounts, not a man who devoted much energy to personal presentation. What he did devote energy to was the land. Schieffelin had an eye for geology, the self-taught kind developed through years of paying close attention to rock formations, to the colour and texture of soil, to the way minerals expressed themselves in the landscape for those who knew how to read the signs. He had heard reports of promising country in the San Pedro Valley area of Arizona Territory, and he made his way there in the spring and summer of 1877, attaching himself for a time to a detachment of soldiers from Camp Huachuca. The soldiers thought he was somewhere between amusing and insane. When he told them he was going prospecting in the hills to the east, into the country where the Chiricahua still operated freely, they offered him the kind of cheerful advice that men offer to people they expect not to survive. One version of the story, which may be embellished but is certainly consistent with the spirit of the moment, has a soldier telling Schieffelin that the only stone he would find out there was his own tombstone. It was a good joke. It was the kind of gallows humour that soldiers in dangerous postings develop as a defence against the anxieties of their situation. The joke also turned out to be one of the most unintentionally prophetic statements in the history of the American West, because when Schieffelin found his silver, he named the claim Tombstone, and the town that grew up around it took the same name. So in a sense, a soldier's wisecrack became the name of an American legend. History is funny that way. Schieffelin spent months in the hills, surviving on determination and whatever he could find. The Chiricahua were present in the region, and he moved carefully, camping without fires, when he felt the situation demanded it, always watchful. He found some promising outcroppings, but nothing definitive. He was running low on resources, and his situation was becoming genuinely precarious. In the fall of 1877, he made his way to the Signal Corps camp at a place called McCracken Mine, in the northern part of the territory, to resupply and rest. There he encountered his brother Al Schieffelin, and later a prospector and mining man named Richard Gerd, who had actual assaying experience and equipment. Schieffelin showed Gerd the ore samples he had collected in the southern hills. Gerd analysed them. The results were, by the standards of experienced mining men in that era, genuinely exciting. The three men formed a partnership and returned south in the winter of 1878. Now there were three of them, which improved their odds of survival, if not their odds of comfort. They worked the hillsides east of the San Pedro River through the early months of 1878, and in February or March of that year, the exact date is disputed in the historical record, as these things often are, they found it. Ed Schieffelin named his first major claim Tombstone. He named a second one, found shortly after the first, the Graveyard. You can see a theme developing. The man had a sense of humour about his situation, which is perhaps what kept him going through the months of solitude and danger that preceded the discovery. The ore in these claims was rich, not moderately promising, not worth further investigation, but genuinely significantly rich. Richard Gerd's assays confirmed it. They were standing on top of one of the most significant silver deposits in the American Southwest. The news spread the way news of mineral strikes always spread in the American West, which is to say, with the speed of rumour and the inevitability of gravity. The three partners tried to keep things quiet initially, which was the rational thing to attempt. But rationality has limited power when people can see that you have suddenly become very interested in staking claims in a particular area. By the summer of 1878, other prospectors were arriving in the hills. The Tombstone mining district was formally organised in the summer of 1878. Claims were staked, arguments about boundaries began immediately, and the machinery of the mining economy started grinding into motion. The ore near the surface was rich and relatively easy to process. The deeper ore, which would eventually prove problematic, lay below the water table and would require pumping technology that was expensive and complicated. But in the early days, nobody was thinking about the depths. They were thinking about the silver that was coming out of the hillsides in quantities that made men's eyes go wide. A town needed to exist near the mines. That much was obvious from the first weeks of significant activity. The mines required workers, and workers required housing, food, water, entertainment, and all the other infrastructure of human settlement. The first questions were where and what form. There were arguments about location, because there are always arguments about location in early settlements. The first camp that emerged near the mines was called Tombstone, naturally, taking the name from the original claim, but its initial location was poorly chosen, lacking adequate water and access, and the settlement shifted and reorganized several times in its first months. By the spring of 1879, a more permanent town site was being established on the plateau above Goose Flats, a site that offered reasonable access to the mines and some defense against the flash floods that could devastate poorly placed desert settlements. The town of Tombstone began, in earnest, to be built. In May of 1879, the Arizona legislature officially incorporated the town. A post office opened. A newspaper appeared, because every frontier settlement worth its name needed a newspaper to tell it what it thought about itself. The Tombstone Epitaph, founded in 1880, would become one of the most famous frontier newspapers in American history, and its name, like the name of the town itself, has a wonderful morbid poetry to it that suits the story perfectly. Richard Gerd, Al Schieffelin, and Ed Schieffelin sold their mining interests in 1880 for the substantial sum of somewhere between $500,000 and $800,000, depending on which account you believe. It was a transformative amount of money by the standards of 1880. Al and Ed promptly did what many men who strike it rich do, which is to go looking for the next big strike. Ed Schieffelin would spend the rest of his life prospecting, never quite finding another tombstone. He died in 1897 in Oregon, alone in a cabin, apparently while examining ore samples. He was found with his prospecting equipment nearby, which seems exactly right. Some people are defined by their search rather than their find, and Ed Schieffelin may have been one of them. But the town he named after a soldier's joke was only just beginning. The town too tough to die. Building Tombstone from dust. There is a phrase associated with Tombstone that you encounter everywhere in the literature about the place, on signs, in tourist brochures, in the titles of books and documentary programs. The town too tough to die. It is a good phrase. It has rhythm and attitude and just enough swagger to capture something true about the spirit of the place. But in the early years, before the legend solidified, before the gunfights and the trials and the vendetta rides, Tombstone was simply a boomtown, which is to say it was chaotic, energetic, frequently dangerous, and absolutely extraordinary in the speed with which it assembled the machinery of civilized life from raw desert dirt. In 1879 and 1880, Tombstone grew at a pace that people who were there could barely comprehend. This was not unusual for major mineral strikes in the American West. The same phenomenon had played out in California in 1849, in Nevada in the 1860s, in Colorado and elsewhere. News of rich ore drew people the way light draws moths, and with roughly the same degree of rational calculation on the part of those drawn. Men arrived by the hundreds, then the thousands. They came from California and from the exhausted mining districts of Nevada. They came from Mexico and from the eastern states. They came from Ireland and from Germany and from China. They came in wagons and on horseback and on foot, carrying what they could and hoping to acquire the rest. The population of Tombstone is difficult to pin down precisely, because census data for rapidly growing frontier settlements is notoriously unreliable. Estimates for the peak period, around 1880 to 1881, range from 5,000 to 15,000 people, with most serious historians settling on something in the range of 7,000 to 10,000. Whatever the exact number, it was enormous for a town that had not existed 3 years earlier in a corner of the territory that had previously contained almost no permanent American settlement whatsoever. What did Tombstone look like in those first years? The honest answer is that it looked like what it was, a place being assembled in real time with the materials at hand, by people who had not necessarily planned to be builders. The earlier structures were canvas and wood, the portable architecture of the frontier that could be erected quickly and abandoned equally quickly if circumstances changed. But Tombstone, unlike many mining camps, demonstrated permanence relatively early. The richness of the ore deposits was evident enough that investors were willing to put real capital into the town, and real capital meant brick and stone and properly constructed buildings. Allen Street became the main commercial thoroughfare of the town, and along its length accumulated the businesses that a working mining community required. Saloons, because of course saloons. The frontier saloon is so stereotyped in our cultural imagination that it has almost become abstract, but in Tombstone's reality, saloons were genuinely central institutions. They were not simply places to drink, though drinking certainly occurred. They were social centres, meeting halls, employment exchanges, and news distribution points. In a community without television or radio or internet, the saloon was where you found out what was happening, who was hiring, what the price of silver was doing, and who had been shot recently. The Crystal Palace and the Oriental and a dozen others served these overlapping functions for Tombstone's population. The gambling that accompanied the drinking was a major economic activity in its own right. Professional gamblers moved from boomtown to boomtown following the money, and Tombstone attracted some of the best and worst of them. Card games ran around the clock in the better establishments, with stakes that could be genuinely significant. Fortunes that had been extracted from the earth during the day were frequently redistributed at the card tables during the night. This is not peculiar to Tombstone. It is one of the defining patterns of mining economy, the extraction of wealth from the ground and its rapid redistribution through the mechanisms of commerce and vice and gambling. The Birdcage Theatre, which opened in December of 1881, became the most famous entertainment venue in Tombstone and one of the most famous in the entire West. It offered a combination of theatrical performances, variety acts, dancing, drinking, and gambling. The name came from the 14 box seats suspended from the ceiling in cage-like structures, where wealthy patrons could watch the show in relative privacy, though privacy may be too strong a word given that the Birdcage was famously, enthusiastically, and continuously noisy. It operated around the clock 7 days a week for the better part of a decade. By the time it closed, the walls and ceiling had accumulated an extraordinary number of bullet holes, which the building preserved and which tourists can still examine today. Someone apparently counted over 140, which, when you think about it, suggests that the entertainment was occasionally supplemented by spontaneous additional excitement. The Tombstone Epitaph, the town's newspaper, deserves particular attention. Founded by John Clum in May of 1880, the Epitaph was a Republican newspaper in a town with significant political divisions, and it served as something more than just a purveyor of local news. Clum was also the mayor of Tombstone at various points, and a supporter of the Earp faction, which meant that the newspaper's coverage of events was not exactly a model of journalistic neutrality, but it was vivid, and it was detailed, and it preserved an enormous amount of information about daily life in Tombstone that would otherwise be lost. The competing newspaper, The Nugget, took a different political line and a different view of the same events, and together the two papers give historians a fascinatingly partisan window into the town's disputes and dramas. Not everyone in Tombstone was a miner or a saloon keeper or a gambler or an outlaw. The town also contained doctors and lawyers and merchants and teachers. Churches were established relatively early, which always surprises people who have absorbed the lawless frontier mythology so thoroughly that they forget that most people, even in frontier towns, were simply trying to live decent lives. A school was organised, ladies' aid societies appeared. The Tombstone Club offered a more genteel form of social activity for those who preferred their recreation without the accompaniment of gunfire. The water situation was a constant challenge. The desert did not offer water generously, and a town of several thousand people required significant quantities of it daily. Hauling water by wagon from the San Pedro River was expensive and inadequate. Eventually a water company was organised to pipe water into town, which represented a significant investment and a significant improvement in the quality of daily life. The heat was a feature of summer life that contemporaries described in terms suggesting genuine physical suffering. Temperatures inside canvas and wooden structures climbed to levels that made work difficult and sleep nearly impossible. The dust was another constant companion, the fine red Arizona dust that worked its way into everything, into food and clothing and hair and lungs, regardless of any effort to exclude it. Fire was an ever-present danger in a town largely built of wood in a hot, dry climate, and Tombstone suffered several significant fires during its peak years that destroyed substantial portions of the business district, and yet people stayed. They stayed because the silver was there, and where there is silver there is money, and where there is money there is the possibility of transformation. The American West of the 1870s and 80s was full of people who had arrived at this particular chapter of their lives through paths that had not gone as planned, and who were looking for a second chance or a first chance, or simply a fresh start in a place where nobody knew their history. Tombstone offered that, and people recognised the offer and accepted it, consequences and all. The town was simultaneously more civilised and more violent than the mythology suggests. It had opera performances and formal dinners, and well-dressed women attending church services and children playing in the streets. It also had regular shootings, stabbings, brawls, and the general disorder that accompanies any rapid gathering of large numbers of young men with money and weapons and alcohol and grievances. The challenge for anyone trying to run a town under these conditions was to manage the violence without either suffocating the freedom that drew people there in the first place, or allowing the chaos to expand to the point where it frightened away the investment and stability that the town needed to survive. That challenge, the challenge of order versus freedom, law versus custom, civilization versus the open range, was what the Tombstone drama was really about. The gunfight at the OK, Corral was not simply an argument between two groups of armed men. It was the violent expression of a conflict that had been building in the town and the territory for years. But to understand that conflict, you need to understand the people who embodied it, starting with the family that arrived in Tombstone in the fall of 1879, looking for opportunity and finding, eventually, everything they bargained for and more. The Earp brothers arrive: law, ambition, and family loyalty. The Earp family story is simultaneously simpler and more complicated than the mythology suggests. Simpler because the basic facts of who they were and what they did are reasonably well documented. More complicated because those facts resist the clean moral framework that the mythology imposes on them. Wyatt Earp is one of the most famous figures in American history, which means that he is also one of the most thoroughly misrepresented, both by those who want to make him a hero and by those who want to puncture that heroism. The truth, as usual, is more interesting than either version. The Earp family, like so many frontier families, had a history of movement. Nicholas Earp, the patriarch, was a restless man who moved his large family repeatedly through the Midwest and West in search of better circumstances. He had been, at various points, a farmer, a constable, a lawyer, and various other things that did not quite stick. His children absorbed from him both the wandering impulse and a bone-deep conviction in the importance of family solidarity. Whatever else the Earps were, they were loyal to each other with a ferocity that was both their greatest strength and ultimately a significant source of their trouble. Virgil Earp was the eldest of the brothers who came to Tombstone, and the one with the most legitimate law enforcement background. He had served as a lawman in various capacities in Arizona Territory before settling in Tombstone, and he genuinely believed in the rule of law as an institution, not just as a source of income. He was a large man, physically imposing, with the steady temperament of someone who had faced dangerous situations many times and learned to control his reactions. He would eventually be appointed United States Deputy Marshal for the Tombstone area, and that appointment was not a trivial thing. It gave him federal authority, which operated somewhat independently of local politics. Wyatt Earp was 31 years old when he arrived in Tombstone in late 1879. He is the one the mythology is really about, the one whose name became synonymous with the Wild West gunfighter archetype, and it is worth spending a moment actually looking at him before the legend gets in the way. Wyatt was tall, over 6 feet, with a long drooping moustache that was characteristic of the era, and a reputation for physical courage that he had earned in various capacities before reaching Tombstone. He had worked as a buffalo hunter, a lawman in Wichita and Dodge City, Kansas, a gambler, and various other frontier occupations. He was not, in 1879, a famous man. He was a capable, experienced frontier operator looking for his next opportunity. An opportunity was exactly what Tombstone seemed to offer. Wyatt's ambitions in Tombstone were not primarily about law enforcement, though he did take a position as a shotgun messenger for Wells Fargo, and later sought a county sheriff appointment that would have given him considerable political and financial power. He also became involved in the gambling industry, eventually acquiring a gambling concession at the Oriental Saloon. This is important context. Wyatt Earp was not in any simple sense a lawman trying to bring order to a lawless town. He was a man with multiple interests, some of which involved upholding the law, and some of which involved making money, and those two sets of interests were sometimes in harmony and sometimes in tension. Morgan Earp, the youngest of the brothers who came to Tombstone, was the most cheerful and the most immediately likable of the group. He was 28 in 1879, handsome by the standards of the surviving photographs, with an easy manner that made him popular in the town's social circles. He worked various jobs in Tombstone, including serving as a shotgun messenger and as a deputy to Virgil. He was by all accounts genuinely brave and genuinely devoted to his family, which were qualities that would matter enormously in the events to come. James Earp, the eldest of the brothers who came to Tombstone, is often forgotten in the retelling because he played little role in the dramatic events. He had been wounded during the Civil War and could not handle a gun effectively as a result. He ran a saloon in Tombstone and stayed largely out of the political conflicts that consumed his brothers. The fact that he survived to old age while his brothers were shot at repeatedly is not entirely unrelated to this relative withdrawal from the action. The Earp wives and partners deserve mention, because they are almost entirely written out of the standard mythology, and yet they were real people, living real lives in a genuinely dangerous place. Wyatt had arrived in Tombstone with a woman named Mattie Blaylock, whom he may or may not have legally married, depending on which records you examine and which lawyers you believe. He would later leave her for Josephine Marcus, a young actress of vivid personality who would survive him and spend much of her long life working to manage his legend. Virgil was accompanied by his wife Allie, whose memoir, recorded late in her life, provides one of the few extended accounts of daily life in Tombstone from the perspective of someone who was there and was not a gambler or a gunfighter. The Earps set up housekeeping in Tombstone in a way that reflected their combination of respectability and frontier practicality. They lived in houses rather than hotels, which was itself a statement of intent. They were not passing through. They were establishing themselves. They dressed well when social circumstances required it, presenting themselves as men of substance rather than itinerant labourers, because appearance mattered on the frontier in ways that are easy to underestimate. The political position that the Earps occupied in Tombstone was from the beginning a complicated one. They were associated with the Republican Party, which was the party of business, of investment, of the town's commercial elite. The Republican establishment in Tombstone wanted law and order, because law and order was good for commerce and investment. They wanted the kind of stability that would attract capital and encourage development. The Earps represented, at least potentially, that kind of stability. But Tombstone's county, Cochise County, had a different political complexion. The rural areas, the ranches and the open range that surrounded the town were largely Democratic territory, and the figure who represented that Democratic rural power was the county sheriff, a man named John Harris Behan, who would become Wyatt Earp's most persistent and consequential adversary. Before getting to Behan, though, there is one other arrival in Tombstone that needs to be addressed, one that was, in its own strange way, more dramatic than any of the Earps. Because in the fall of 1880, a thin, pale, extremely dangerous man named John Henry Holliday came to town. Doc Holliday, the dying man who refused to go quietly. There are figures in history who seem almost too extreme to be real, whose actual documented lives read more like fiction than like the sober record of ordinary human experience. John Henry Holliday is one of those figures. If you invented Doc Holliday as a fictional character, readers would probably tell you that you had pushed too hard, that a tubercular dentist turned professional gambler and gunfighter with a complex relationship with violence and a genuine intellectual education was simply too much. Too many contradictions loaded into one person. But Holliday was entirely real, and the contradictions are precisely what make him so compelling. He was born in Griffin, Georgia in 1851 into a family of some social standing in the antebellum South. His father was a lawyer and a former Confederate officer. His mother, Alice Jane McKee Holliday, was the formative figure of his early life, a woman of warmth and intelligence who died of tuberculosis when John Henry was 15 years old. The disease that killed his mother would eventually kill him too, though it took a remarkably long time given how little cooperation Doc Holliday offered to that process. He trained as a dentist in Baltimore and Philadelphia, receiving a genuinely good professional education at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, from which he graduated in 1872. He returned to Georgia and set up practice in Atlanta, and by all accounts was a competent and even skilled dentist. He was also, by 1872 or 1873, clearly suffering from tuberculosis, which in the era before antibiotics was a death sentence of uncertain but generally not too distant schedule. The standard advice for tuberculosis patients in the 1870s was dry air and a warm climate. The Southwest fit this description, and Holliday made his way there, eventually landing in Dallas, Texas, where he attempted to resume his dental practice. But there is a fundamental tension between running a dental practice and having tuberculosis. Patients who learned that their dentist was coughing blood were, perhaps understandably, reluctant to open their mouths anywhere near him. Business declined. Gambling, on the other hand, did not require close personal contact, and Holliday discovered that he was good at it. Specifically, he was good at poker and faro, the two dominant card games of the frontier gambling world. He was intelligent, mathematically minded in the way that good card players need to be, and possessed of a particular psychological quality that gave him an advantage at the table. That quality was a genuine indifference to losing. When you're already dying of tuberculosis and you know it, the prospect of losing money at cards does not carry the same weight as it might for someone with a more confident relationship with the future. This indifference to risk, which some people read as courage and others read as despair, made him a formidable opponent. It also made him dangerous in situations of physical confrontation. A man who does not particularly expect to survive the year does not respond to threats the way a man with everything to live for does. Doc Holliday was involved in various violent incidents across Texas, Colorado, and other territories in the years before he came to Tombstone. Killings were attributed to him, though the historical record is somewhat murky about exactly how many and under what circumstances. What is clear is that he had a reputation for being extremely willing to escalate situations to lethal violence, which was not the kind of reputation that encouraged people to start trouble with him. His relationship with a woman named Mary Catherine Harrony, universally known as Big Nose Kate, was one of the defining personal relationships of his life. Kate was a Hungarian-born woman who had made her way to the frontier and worked variously as a prostitute and as an independent operator of various kinds. She and Doc had a relationship of extraordinary volatility, breaking up and reuniting repeatedly over many years, arguing violently and apparently reconciling with equal enthusiasm. Kate later provided some of the most detailed personal accounts of Doc's life, though her reliability as a narrator was complicated by her sometimes difficult relationship with the truth and her complicated feelings about the man she was describing. Doc Holliday came to Tombstone in the fall of 1880, and his arrival coincided with a period when his friendship with Wyatt Earp was becoming an important factor in the social dynamics of the town. The friendship between these two men has fascinated people ever since, partly because they seem like such an unlikely pair. Wyatt was controlled, methodical, a man who thought about consequences and played long games. Doc was impulsive, volatile, sometimes reckless, a man who lived in a permanent present tense because his future was uncertain at best, and yet they were genuinely devoted to each other, and that devotion would prove consequential. What did Doc look like in Tombstone? The surviving photographs show a slender man, already wasted by disease in the way that tuberculosis wastes its victims, with pale skin and light eyes, and a slightly haunted quality that the camera captures even through the stiff formality of Victorian portraiture. He weighed perhaps 135 pounds when he arrived in Tombstone, and he was probably already past the point where a 20th century physician would have given him more than a few years. He would live for 7 more, dying in a sanitarium in Glenwood Springs, Colorado in 1887, aged 36. In Tombstone, Doc worked primarily as a gambler, dealing faro at various establishments and playing cards professionally. He also occasionally practiced dentistry, which suggests either ongoing optimism about his condition or simply that the skills were there and sometimes they were needed. He was a difficult presence in the social world of Tombstone because his volatility and his reputation made him someone that respectable people preferred to keep at arm's length, even as his connection to the Earps gave him a degree of social legitimacy that pure gamblers and gunfighters did not always enjoy. His relationship with the Cowboys, the loosely organized outlaw network that would form the other side of Tombstone's great conflict, was poisonous from an early stage. He despised them with a particular intensity that went beyond simple rivalry. Part of this was that he was a Southerner of some social background who looked at the Cowboys and saw men he considered beneath him. Part of it was that the Cowboys were dangerous in a specific way that complicated his professional life as a gambler, and part of it was simply chemistry, the inexplicable but powerful hostility that sometimes develops between groups of people in close proximity. Doc Holliday was not a good man in any simple sense. He killed people. He was an alcoholic, though that particular condition did not exactly make him unusual in the company he kept. He was often unpleasant, sharp-tongued to the point of genuine cruelty, and possessed of a temper that his illness and his whiskey combined to make even less reliable than it might otherwise have been. But he was also, by the accounts of those who knew him well, capable of real loyalty and real courage, and in the events of 1881 those qualities would be the ones that mattered. The Cowboys, outlaws, cattle rustlers, and the Clanton McClory world. The word cowboy carried different freight in 1881 than it does today. Today it suggests romanticized images of men on horseback, open range, the honest labor of cattle work, the freedom of the frontier. In Tombstone's time, in Cochise County specifically, the word cowboy was used the way you might use words like outlaw or rustler, as a term that described a specific social group with specific economic practices that existed on the wrong side of the law while maintaining a degree of social legitimacy among the rural population that the law struggled to understand or address. The cowboys of Cochise County were not a single organized criminal organization with a hierarchy and membership roles. They were more like a loose network of affiliated individuals who shared certain economic interests, mostly in the cattle trade, certain social spaces, mostly the ranches and saloons of the rural area south of Tombstone, and certain political allegiances, mostly Democratic and anti-Earp. They engaged in cattle rustling on a significant scale, stealing cattle from Mexican ranches across the border and driving them north to sell in Arizona and New Mexico Territory markets. This was their primary economic activity, and it was both genuinely criminal and widely accepted by the Anglo-rural population of the territory, who had complicated feelings about Mexican property rights and who were happy to buy cheap cattle without asking too many questions about their provenance. The central family in the cowboy network was the Clantons. Newman Haynes Clanton, known as Old Man Clanton, was the patriarch, a rancher who had established his operation in the San Pedro Valley and who served as a kind of organizational hub for the cattle rustling enterprise. He was murdered by Mexican forces in August of 1881 in retaliation for previous raids on Mexican ranchers, which gives you a sense of how deeply the cross-border raiding had embedded itself in cycles of violence that extended well beyond Tombstone's immediate concerns. His sons were more directly involved in the events that are the focus of this story. Isaac Clanton, known as Ike, was the eldest of the surviving sons and the most politically active of the cowboy faction in Tombstone. Ike was, by almost every account, including sympathetic ones, not the most impressive figure in the room. He talked a great deal, drank heavily, and had a tendency to make threats that he subsequently lacked the will or the ability to follow through on. He was not a gunfighter in any serious sense, and the events of October 1881 would demonstrate this clearly. But he was politically connected, and he was loud, and he was determined, and those qualities gave him a degree of influence in the community that his actual capabilities might not have justified. Finn Clanton, Ike's brother, was a more substantial character, quieter and more practically effective, though he avoided the most dramatic moments of the family's conflict with the Earps. The McClory brothers, Frank and Tom, were not Clantons but were closely associated with them through shared ranching interests and shared social networks in the rural county. They were ranchers themselves, operating a spread in the Sulphur Springs Valley, and they were known to buy and sell cattle of questionable provenance, along with their legitimate stock. Frank was the more prominent of the two in the social and economic world of the cowboys. Tom was younger and seems to have been somewhat overshadowed by his brother and by circumstances. Both of them would be dead before the end of October 1881. The two figures who gave the cowboy faction its real menace, as opposed to its political influence, were not Clantons or McClorys, but rather Curly Bill Brocius and Johnny Ringo. These two men represented the genuine gunfighting capacity of the cowboy network, and their presence in the social world of Cochise County was a constant source of concern for anyone interested in maintaining order. Curly Bill Brocius, whose real name was William Brocius and possibly William Graham, since the records of frontier men's lives were not always carefully kept, was a large, physically powerful man with a reputation for violence and a personality that contemporaries described as alternately charming and terrifying. He had a gift for getting himself into situations where people ended up dead, most infamously in October of 1880 when he shot and killed Tombstone's town marshal, Fred White, in circumstances that were disputed. Curly Bill claimed the shooting was accidental, that he was twirling his pistol and it discharged unintentionally. This defense, which required the jury to believe that Curly Bill was twirling his pistol in front of a law officer in a situation of some tension and that this was entirely innocent behaviour, was nevertheless accepted, and he was acquitted. Marshal White had, apparently, as he lay dying, told Wyatt Earp that he believed the shooting was accidental, and that statement carried weight in the legal proceedings. Johnny Ringo is in some ways the most mysterious figure in the entire Tombstone drama, and mystery in the American mythology of the West tends to breed legend. He was educated, which was unusual in the cowboy milieu. Some accounts credit him with a classical education, knowledge of Latin, familiarity with literature, qualities that sat in jarring contrast with his violent occupation. He was a heavy drinker, possibly an alcoholic, and he cycled through periods of apparently sociable behaviour and periods of dark, brooding withdrawal that scared even people who were comfortable around dangerous men. He had been involved in a vigilante killing in Texas before coming to Arizona, which gave him a history of violence that preceded his Tombstone involvement. Ringo and Doc Holliday had a particular antagonism that electrified the social atmosphere of Tombstone whenever they were in the same space. Both men were educated, both were drinkers, both were deeply and genuinely dangerous, and they seemed to irritate each other at some fundamental level that went beyond mere political alliance. There are various accounts of confrontations between them in Tombstone, some probably embellished, that suggest the relationship was one of mutual contempt and mutual wariness. The cowboys operated primarily in the rural areas of Cochise County, on the ranches and in the small communities south of Tombstone toward the Mexican border. They moved cattle north from Mexico, sold it through various channels, and lived lives that were by many material measures quite successful, even if the success was built on theft. They had money, they had horses, they had guns, and they had political support from a significant portion of the county's population, which meant that they could operate with a degree of impunity that infuriated the Earp faction and the Tombstone commercial establishment. The relationship between the cowboys and the county's law enforcement, specifically the county sheriff's office, was complicated in ways that would become central to the Great Conflict of 1881. The sheriff of Cochise County was a man who had personal reasons of his own to be in conflict with the Earps, and his attitude toward the cowboys was, to put it politely, accommodating. A town divided, politics, power, and the road to violence. To understand why the gunfight at the OK Corral happened, you need to understand that it was not really about a gunfight. It was about an election. Well, that is a slight simplification, but only slight. The roots of the Tombstone conflict were political and economic, as much as they were personal, and the personal animosities that eventually expressed themselves in gunfire were themselves products of a political situation that had been building for months before October 1881. Cochise County was created by the Arizona Territorial Legislature in February of 1881, carved out of the eastern portion of Pima County, in recognition of the area's rapid growth and the practical impossibility of governing such a large area from Tucson. The creation of the new county meant the creation of new offices, new opportunities for political power and economic influence. The most important of these was the county sheriff, a position that came with significant legitimate power, including tax collection and law enforcement, and equally significant opportunities for corruption and personal enrichment. The sheriff's race of 1880 was, in retrospect, the moment when Tombstone's fate was being determined. Two men wanted the position. John Harris Bayon, a Democratic politician with long-standing ties in Arizona Territory, was one candidate. Wyatt Earp, whose Republican connections and law enforcement background made him a credible contender, was the other. Bayon was, by the accounts of people who encountered him, a genuinely charming man. He was not physically imposing, but he was socially capable, good at the kind of interpersonal navigation that politics requires, good at making people feel that he was sympathetic to their concerns. He was also, by the accounts of people who encountered him in different contexts, thoroughly untrustworthy in professional matters, a man whose pleasant manner concealed a willingness to say whatever was useful in the moment, without particular regard for whether it was true. There was also, because this is Tombstone and nothing could be simple, a woman involved. Josephine Marcus, the young actress who would eventually become Wyatt Earp's lifelong companion, was at this point involved with John Bayon. She had come to Tombstone with a theatrical troupe, encountered Bayon, and been drawn into his orbit. The story of her transition from Bayon's household to Wyatt's companionship is one of the personal threads running through the larger political drama, and while it would be reductive to suggest that the Earpian conflict was primarily romantic in origin, it would be equally inaccurate to pretend that personal animosity between the two men was not intensified by this dimension. The political deal that was supposedly reached between Earp and Bayon, in which Bayon promised to appoint Wyatt as undersheriff if Wyatt would withdraw from the race, and then either made no such promise or made it, and then broke it depending on whose account you believe, is one of those moments where the personal and the political fuse in a way that becomes historically consequential. Wyatt withdrew from the race. Bayon became sheriff. The undersheriff appointment went to someone else. Whether this was a betrayal or simply a misunderstanding, it became the context within which every subsequent interaction between Bayon and Earp was coloured. Bayon's relationship with the cowboys was the most consequential aspect of his tenure as sheriff, and the most damning from the perspective of his critics. He hired Frank McClory's associate Harry Woods as his undersheriff, a man with known cowboy sympathies. He declined, repeatedly and consistently, to pursue the cowboys for their cattle rustling activities with any particular energy. He served warrants selectively, in ways that seemed to align with political convenience, rather than the requirements of law. He was, in the assessment of the Earp faction and many later historians, essentially an enabler of the outlaw network that was terrorizing the region, if not quite a participant in it. This is probably too harsh and too simple. Behan's situation was genuinely difficult. The cowboys had real political support in the county. Pursuing them aggressively without adequate resources would likely have resulted in failure and possibly in casualties among his deputies, and the legal situation with cross-border cattle rustling was complicated enough that building prosecutable cases was genuinely difficult. Some of what looked like collusion may have been rational risk assessment. But the outcome was the same, regardless of the motivation. The cowboys operated with relative impunity in Cochise County. Stage robberies occurred. Wells Fargo's operations were repeatedly disrupted. The commercial establishment in Tombstone, which depended on safe transportation of silver and other goods, was increasingly anxious and increasingly angry. Wyatt Earp, who had connections to Wells Fargo and a professional interest in stopping stage robberies, was increasingly convinced that the criminal situation in the county required decisive action. The spring and summer of 1881 saw the tensions ratcheting up through a series of incidents. In March of 1881, the Benson stage was robbed, and 2 people were killed, including the driver and a passenger. This was a significant escalation. Wells Fargo and the territorial authorities wanted the perpetrators caught and prosecuted. The investigation that followed became a political battlefield, with Wyatt and Virgil Earp working the case from their direction and Behan from his, and each side convinced the other was either incompetent or actively obstructing justice. The question of who actually robbed the Benson stage remains somewhat murky. The Earp faction focused suspicion on various cowboys. Behan's investigation pointed in different directions. At one point, Ike Clanton became involved in a covert conversation with Wyatt Earp in which, according to Wyatt, Ike agreed to provide information about the stage robbers' whereabouts in exchange for the reward money, an arrangement that, if it happened as described, put Ike Clanton in the extraordinarily precarious position of secretly cooperating with his political enemies. When word of this alleged arrangement began to leak, Ike Clanton had reason to be genuinely frightened about what the cowboys might do to him if they found out, and one way to defuse that threat was to make the situation so public and so confrontational that any suggestion of his cooperation could be dismissed as impossible. By October of 1881, the temperature in Tombstone had reached a level where the only question was when and where the explosion would occur. Multiple incidents of harassment and threat had accumulated. The cowboys had made no secret of their contempt for the Earps and their intention to harm them if the opportunity arose. The Earps had made equally little secret of their view that the cowboys represented an ongoing criminal threat that needed to be addressed. The political situation had calcified into 2 opposing camps with irreconcilable interests, and in a town where nearly everyone was armed, irreconcilable interests had a way of expressing themselves in specific and irreversible ways. The morning of October 25, 1881, Ike Clanton came to Tombstone and started drinking. He was angry, he was afraid, and he talked. He talked to anyone who would listen, and what he said was not good. The gunfight at the OK Corral, 30 seconds that echoed forever. Let us take a breath here, because we are about to describe 30 seconds of gunfire on a Wednesday afternoon in October 1881 that became the most famous event in the history of the American West, and the temptation, given the weight of mythology that has accumulated around those 30 seconds, is either to over-dramatize them or to ironically undercut them. Neither feels right. What happened in the vacant lot near the OK Corral on October 26, 1881 was genuinely significant, genuinely violent, and genuinely consequential. It deserves to be told as clearly and as honestly as the imperfect historical record allows. The preceding 24 hours set the stage. Ike Clanton had been in Tombstone since the evening of October 25th, drinking and telling anyone who would listen that the Earps had better watch themselves. He visited various saloons, including the Occidental, where he had a conversation with Tom McClory. He apparently played cards through much of the night, which given his state of intoxication must have been a remarkable card game. He made statements threatening the Earps and Doc Holliday, statements that were heard by enough people that word reached the Earps themselves by the early morning hours of October the 26th. Wyatt and Virgil Earp, and possibly Morgan, went looking for Ike in the early morning. Doc Holliday, who had been playing cards and was apparently awake at 4 in the morning because that was the kind of schedule Doc kept, encountered Ike and had a confrontation in which harsh words were exchanged. This was not unusual. Harsh words were frequently exchanged, but the accumulation of threats was becoming problematic. On the morning of October 26th, Ike Clanton was still in Tombstone, still armed despite laws prohibiting the carrying of weapons within the town limits, and still making threatening statements. Virgil Earp, in his capacity as chief of police, pistol-whipped Ike and arrested him for carrying weapons in the city limits. This was both legally justifiable and deliberately humiliating. Ike was taken before the magistrate, fined, and had his weapons confiscated. This did not improve his mood. Tom McClory arrived in town during the morning and had his own confrontation with Wyatt Earp, during which Wyatt pistol-whipped McClory as well. The reasons for this action are somewhat disputed. Wyatt claimed McClory had made a threatening movement. McClory's supporters claimed he was unarmed and had done nothing to justify the assault. Whatever the truth, by early afternoon of October 26th, both Ike Clanton and Tom McClory had been physically assaulted by members of the Earp Party, and were, to put it mildly, in an agitated state. Frank McClory and Billy Clanton arrived in town during the afternoon. Billy Clanton was 19 years old, this is worth noting, 19 years old. Whatever he was or was not, whatever company he kept or plans he had, he was 19 years old on the day he died. By early afternoon, the group that would become the losing side of the gunfight was gathered in and around the OK Corral, a livery stable that occupied the block between Fremont and Allen Streets. There were 5 of them: Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, Tom McClory, and a man named Billy Claiborne, who appears in some accounts and not others, and who managed in the event to be elsewhere when the shooting started, which may have been the smartest thing anyone did that day. Virgil Earp was receiving conflicting advice about what to do. Some people told him the cowboys were about to leave town, that the situation would resolve itself without intervention. Others, including Wyatt, argued that the threats had escalated to a point where allowing the cowboys to leave armed and furious was itself dangerous, that they might ambush the Earps on some future occasion if not confronted now. After some deliberation, Virgil made the decision to go and disarm them. The party that walked down Fremont Street toward the lot near the OK Corral at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon consisted of Virgil Earp, who carried a cane he had borrowed, concealing his pistol in his coat and carrying a shotgun he had borrowed from the Wells Fargo office, Wyatt Earp, Morgan Earp, and Doc Holliday, who had the shotgun, actually, which is a detail that matters in the account of what followed. Virgil had given the shotgun to Doc and was carrying the cane more openly, the logic being that Doc with a shotgun might be less likely to trigger an immediate violent response than Doc with a pistol. This was optimistic reasoning. They walked down Fremont Street in a line that must have looked, to anyone watching from the sidewalks, like exactly what it was, a confrontation moving toward its conclusion. The lot where the Clanton-McClory group was gathered was approximately 18 feet wide. When the Earp party arrived, the two groups were separated by about 6 feet, which in gunfighting terms is close enough to be nearly impossible to miss. What happened in the first seconds of the confrontation is disputed. Both sides claimed the other fired first. Virgil reportedly said, "Boys, I want your guns," or words to that effect. Someone, and historians have argued about who for 140 years, fired the first shot. What is not disputed is the result. The gunfight lasted approximately 30 seconds. When it was over, Billy Clanton and Frank McClory were dead at the scene, or very nearly so. Tom McClory was also dying, hit with buckshot from Doc Holliday's shotgun. Virgil Earp had been wounded in the leg. Morgan Earp had been shot through the shoulder. Wyatt Earp was entirely unhurt, which he always was in gunfights, a quality that contributed significantly to his subsequent legend. Doc Holliday had been grazed by a bullet that hit his holster, giving him a superficial wound. Ike Clanton, who had spent the previous day and a half making violent threats, grabbed Wyatt Earp's arm at the outset of the shooting and begged for mercy, then ran when Wyatt pushed him away. He was unhurt. Billy Claiborne had already made himself scarce, so the men who had done the most talking were alive and the men who had been in their company were dead, or dying. Ike Clanton would spend years afterward insisting that the Earps had murdered his companions in cold blood. Given his own conduct during the gunfight, this insistence had a quality that was difficult for many people to take seriously. Billy Clanton died later that afternoon, reportedly calling for more ammunition even as he was dying, which is one of those details that may be embellished by storytelling, but which has been repeated often enough that it has become part of the narrative. He was 19 years old. Frank McClory and Tom McClory were buried in the Boot Hill Cemetery along with him, and their funeral became a political demonstration, with thousands of Tombstone residents turning out in a show of sympathy that the Earp faction found alarming. The question of whether the gunfight was a justified law enforcement action or a murder was not settled on October 26, 1881. It was not settled in the weeks of legal proceedings that followed. It has not been settled by 140 years of historical argument since. That unresolved quality, that genuine ambiguity about whether the right people died on the right side for the right reasons, is part of what makes the story endure. The inquest and the trial. Was it murder or justice? The bodies were barely cold before the legal machinery began grinding into motion, because in Tombstone in 1881, as in most places and most times, what happened after the violence was determined not by the violence itself but by the politics surrounding it. The gunfight at the OK Corral did not resolve Tombstone's conflict. It intensified it. The legal proceedings that followed were initiated by Ike Clanton, who filed murder charges against Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, and Doc Holliday. This was, in retrospect, an extraordinarily bold move from a man who had been begging for mercy while his companions were being shot. But Ike Clanton's personal courage and his political courage were operating on different scales, and in the political realm he was willing to press the attack with whatever tools were available to him. The hearing before Justice of the Peacewell Spicer began in late October 1881 and continued through November. Spicer was not a neutral figure in the town's political landscape, but he was a judge with legal experience and a responsibility to examine the evidence with at least procedural fairness. The hearing was, by the standards of frontier justice proceedings, a substantial affair. Witnesses were called, testimony was taken. The two sides presented their accounts of the events with the particular conviction of people who have experienced the same events and arrived at entirely different conclusions about what they saw. The testimony that emerged from the hearing painted a picture of extraordinary complexity. Every major factual question was disputed. Who was armed? Several witnesses testified that Tom McClory was unarmed at the time of the shooting. Others testified that he had a rifle on his horse and could have reached for it. The question mattered enormously, because if Tom McClory was unarmed, then his killing by Doc Holliday's shotgun was very difficult to justify as a defensive act. If he was armed and reaching for a weapon, it was another matter. Who fired first? Witnesses on the cowboy side testified that Wyatt fired first without provocation. Witnesses on the Earp side testified that Frank McClory or Billy Clanton drew first. Doc Holliday, who had a talent for memorable self-presentation, testified in his own way that anyone who doubted his version of events was welcome to prove otherwise, or words to that effect. Were the Earps acting in their official capacity as law officers, or were they acting as private individuals seeking personal revenge for weeks of harassment? This question had significant legal implications. If they were acting as officers attempting to disarm men who were violating the city ordinance against carrying weapons, then the confrontation was a law enforcement action, and the violence that resulted from it was, at least arguably, legally justified. If they were acting as private citizens engaged in a personal quarrel, then the legal calculation was entirely different. Wyatt Earp's written statement to Justice Spicer, which has been preserved, and which reads with a clarity and organisation that suggests either excellent legal coaching or genuine intelligence or both, argued the law enforcement framing forcefully. He described the cowboys as making threats, as being armed and refusing to disarm when ordered to do so by a sworn officer, and as initiating the violence that followed. He presented himself as a man who had spent months attempting to maintain order against a criminal organisation that operated with the protection of the county sheriff's political connections. The Cowboys' supporters presented the opposite narrative with equal conviction. They described unarmed or partially armed men who were preparing to leave town when they were ambushed by a party of 4 armed men with established personal grievances against them. They pointed to the dead and the dying as evidence of murder rather than law enforcement. Ike Clanton's testimony was extensive and detailed, and was received by many observers with skepticism, partly because of his conduct during the gunfight itself, and partly because Ike had a reputation for saying whatever seemed useful in the moment. But his was not the only voice on his side, and some of the other witnesses who testified against the Earps were people with no obvious personal stake in the outcome. Justice Spicer deliberated for a significant period, and produced a written opinion that is itself one of the important historical documents of the Tombstone story. He found that there was insufficient evidence of murder to hold the defendants for trial. He found that Virgil Earp had the authority to attempt to disarm the cowboys, and that the Earps and Doc Holliday had acted in good faith as law officers, in a situation that escalated beyond their ability to control peacefully. He did offer some criticism of specific decisions, noting that sending Doc Holliday with the party was perhaps not the most judicious choice given Holliday's known reputation, but he found that this imprudence did not rise to the level of criminal wrongdoing. The decision satisfied almost nobody. The cowboy faction was outraged. They had sought justice, or at least the punishment of their enemies, through the legal system, and the legal system had declined to deliver it. Their only remaining options were political pressure and violence. They would pursue both. The Earp faction was relieved but not entirely vindicated. The hearing had produced extensive public testimony about the events of October 26th and the weeks leading up to it, and while Spicer's decision exonerated them legally, it also laid out in public record a great deal of information about the political and personal dimensions of the conflict that did not reflect entirely well on anyone. Tombstone's population remained deeply divided. The political fault lines that had existed before the gunfight had not been healed by the hearing. They had been formalised. There were people in Tombstone who were quite certain that Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday had committed murder in broad daylight in a narrow lot on Fremont Street. And there were people who were equally certain that the Earps had performed a public service by removing 3 dangerous men from the streets. Both of these groups were going to be living in the same town for the foreseeable future. What happened next made everything that had come before look like a polite disagreement. Vendetta Ride, Wyatt Earp's War. In the weeks following Justice Spicer's decision, Tombstone held its breath. The acquittal had not resolved anything. The cowboys still controlled the county's political machinery through their alliance with Behan. The Earps still represented the town's commercial and Republican establishment. Both sides knew that the October gunfight had not been a conclusion. It had been a beginning. December 18th, 1881. Virgil Earp was walking from the Oriental Saloon to his home late in the evening. As he crossed 5th Street, men concealed in an unfinished building on the opposite side of the street opened fire with shotguns. Virgil was hit multiple times. He went down in the street. People rushed to him, expecting to find him dead. He was not dead. He was very badly wounded, with his left arm so severely damaged that it would have to be partially amputated, leaving him without the full use of his arm for the rest of his life. But he was alive. The attackers were not identified with certainty. The cowboys denied involvement. The Earp faction pointed at the cowboy network. Ike Clanton, who had been in town that evening, came under suspicion, as did various other cowboys. No one was ever charged. Wyatt Earp received the news with a particular controlled fury of a man whose controlled exterior has just been presented with information that tests it severely. Virgil would survive, but he would never again be the physical presence he had been. The message was clear. The cowboys were not finished. They had the patience to wait and the willingness to use ambush rather than open confrontation, which meant that the Earp family's safety depended on factors they could not fully control. Morgan Earp continued to work in Tombstone, operating with the particular combination of ordinary life and ongoing danger that characterized the family's situation in those months. He played billiards. He had dinner with friends. He went about the business of daily living in a town where a significant faction of the population wanted his family dead. March 18th, 1882. Morgan Earp was playing billiards at Campbell and Hatch's Saloon, a popular establishment on Allen Street. He was playing with a friend named Bob Hatch, who recalled afterward that Morgan had been in excellent spirits that evening, laughing and talking as he moved around the table. At approximately 11 o'clock, shots came through the rear window of the billiard room. One bullet struck Morgan Earp in the back, passing through his body. A second bullet struck the wall near Wyatt Earp, who was watching the game from a chair. Morgan fell. Wyatt reached him within seconds. Morgan Earp was 29 years old. He was conscious for a short time after being shot and died within the hour. His last words, according to various accounts, included something directed at Wyatt about a vision or a dream, though the exact words were recorded differently by different people who were present. He was the most cheerful and the most immediately likable of the brothers, the one people in Tombstone who knew the family personally recalled with the most warmth. He was killed from ambush through a window while playing billiards. Wyatt Earp's response to the murder of his brother was not immediate gunfire. It was something more deliberate and more terrible. He made arrangements for Virgil, still recovering from his wounds, to travel north to California with Virgil's wife and other family members for their safety. He attended to Morgan's body, and then he began putting together the people and the plan for what would come next. The Vendetta Ride, as it has come to be called, lasted roughly 2 weeks in March and April of 1882. Wyatt assembled a posse that included Doc Holliday, his brother Warren Earp, a gunfighter named Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, a man named Texas Jack Vermillion, and others whose names appear in various accounts. This was not a law enforcement posse in any formal sense. Wyatt had been given a federal deputy marshal's commission, but the authority it carried in the specific context of what followed was somewhat theoretical. This was closer to a hunting party with legal cover. What the posse did over those 2 weeks has been documented in parts and mythologized extensively. They killed Frank Stillwell at the Tucson Railroad Station in circumstances that Wyatt claimed were self-defense and that others claimed were an execution. Stillwell was a deputy of Bairn's with known cowboy connections and was widely suspected of involvement in Morgan's murder. They killed Florentino Cruz, a man suspected of carrying information for the killers, at a wood camp in the mountains south of Tombstone. They killed Curly Bill Brocious at a place called Iron Springs or Mescal Springs in the Whetstone Mountains, in what Wyatt described as a genuine gunfight in which he walked into the range of multiple armed men and killed Brocious with a shotgun at close range while the other cowboys fled. This killing was disputed. The cowboys and their supporters denied that Curly Bill was there at all, or denied that he was killed, though he was never heard from again after that date, which suggests that whatever happened at Iron Springs, it was decisive. During and after these killings, John Behan attempted to arrest Wyatt for murder, producing warrants that Wyatt refused to acknowledge. There was a scene at one point where Behan attempted to stop Wyatt in the street, and Wyatt essentially told him, with a directness that was not quite threatening but was very close, that Behan should step aside. Behan stepped aside. The warrants were real, but Behan's ability to enforce them against an armed federal deputy marshal, surrounded by armed companions, was limited. By late March 1882, with the warrants outstanding and the political situation in Arizona Territory turned definitively against him, Wyatt Earp left Arizona. He never returned as a permanent resident, though he visited occasionally in later years. He took with him Doc Holliday and the others in his posse, crossing into Colorado. The vendetta ride accomplished what Wyatt intended it to accomplish, at least partially. Several men who were believed to have been involved in the murders of Morgan Earp and the maiming of Virgil Earp were dead. The cowboy network was severely disrupted, but Wyatt was now a fugitive, at least from the perspective of Arizona law, though Colorado declined to extradite him given the political complexities of the situation. He had avenged his brother. He had transformed himself in the process from a complicated and somewhat morally ambiguous frontier lawman into something that the mythology would eventually make him, a figure who operated outside the law in service of a personal code of loyalty. Whether that transformation was heroic or criminal depended entirely on your political and moral starting point. In Tombstone, it depended on whether you lived in town or in the county, the decline of the cowboys, how the outlaw gang fell apart. The vendetta ride was not the only force dismantling the cowboy network in 1882. It was the most dramatic, but the criminal organization that had dominated the rural areas of Cochise County was already under pressure from multiple directions before Wyatt Earp turned it into a personal mission. The death of Old Man Clanton in August of 1881 had already removed the organizational center of gravity of the cattle-rustling enterprise. He had been the hub around which a lot of the network's activities revolved, not necessarily as a criminal mastermind, but as an experienced rancher with the connections and the established operations that gave the rustling trade its infrastructure. Without him, the enterprise became more diffuse, more dependent on individual actors with less coherence. The deaths at the OK Corral removed Frank McClory, who had been one of the more capable and respected figures on the cowboy side, and Billy Clanton, who while young had been part of a family network of some importance. Tom McClory's death removed another participant in the cattle trade. 3 funerals in one afternoon is not a minor impact on any organization. The death of Curly Bill Brocious, if it occurred as Wyatt described at Iron Springs, removed the most physically dangerous member of the network. Whatever Curly Bill's personal qualities, he represented the kind of muscular enforcement capacity that made the cowboys genuinely threatening rather than merely annoying. His disappearance from the historical record in the spring of 1882, whatever its exact circumstances, was the disappearance of the most dangerous man the cowboys had. Johnny Ringo remained. And Johnny Ringo's end is one of the genuine mysteries of the Tombstone story. On July 13th, 1882, Ringo's body was found in a canyon in the Chiricahua Mountains. He had been shot once through the head. His pistol was in his hand and had 1 cartridge fired. He was found sitting against a tree partially undressed, with his boots removed or displaced in a way that struck investigators as unusual. The official verdict was suicide. There are people who accept that verdict and people who find it entirely unacceptable, and there is enough ambiguity in the physical evidence to sustain a genuine historical debate. If it was suicide, Ringo chose to end his life in an isolated canyon, which is not impossible for a man whose periods of depression were well documented. If it was murder, several suspects have been proposed over the years, including Wyatt Earp, who was in the general region of Arizona at the time, though he was supposed to have left, Doc Holliday, and various others. Doc Holliday claimed on his deathbed that he had killed Ringo, which is exactly the kind of statement a man like Doc Holliday might make with his last breath for any of several reasons. Wyatt Earp made occasional cryptic statements about Ringo's death over the years that suggested he knew more than he was saying but never admitted direct involvement. The truth is that we do not know for certain whether Johnny Ringo killed himself or was killed, and the uncertainty has been a gift to storytellers ever since. With Ringo gone, the Cowboy Network effectively ceased to function as a coherent force. Individual members continued to operate, getting into trouble of various kinds in various places. Ike Clanton continued to be involved in cattle operations of questionable legality, and was eventually shot and killed in 1887 in a confrontation with a detective who had been tracking stolen cattle. His death was not quite the dramatic end that the mythology of the Tombstone story might prescribe, but it was consistent with the trajectory of a man whose life had been defined by bad decisions made loudly. John Bayon was removed from office when his term expired and was not reappointed. The political winds in Arizona Territory had shifted enough that his usefulness to the networks that had supported him was diminished. He went on to other things, as people in politics do, though his reputation in the historical literature has never fully recovered from the role he played in the Tombstone conflict. The dismantling of the Cowboys was gradual rather than sudden, a process of deaths and arrests and departures and simple economic change that unfolded over 2 or 3 years rather than a single decisive moment. But by the mid-1880s, the organized rustling network that had operated in Cochise County was no longer a functioning enterprise, and Cochise County itself was no longer the violent frontier it had been during the Tombstone boomtown years. The Apache Wars also moved toward their conclusion. Geronimo's final surrender to General Nelson Miles in September of 1886 ended the last sustained military resistance by the Chiricahua Apache. The surrender was a tragedy for the Chiricahua people, who were exiled to Florida and later to Oklahoma in conditions that killed a significant percentage of them, but it removed the last major source of frontier danger in southern Arizona and changed the character of the region permanently. The town itself was meanwhile undergoing its own transformation, one that had nothing to do with cowboys or lawmen or gunfights. Tombstone's boom and bust. When the silver ran out, the gunfights and the politics and the legal proceedings had unfolded against a backdrop of genuine prosperity, and it is easy, when you are focused on the drama of the thing, to forget that Tombstone in its peak years was primarily a mining town, and mining towns are not like other towns. They do not grow slowly and organically from agricultural roots or trade relationships, or the accumulated presence of families over generations. They explode into existence because something valuable is in the ground, and they contract, sometimes catastrophically, when that something becomes inaccessible or unprofitable or exhausted. The life cycle of a mining boomtown is not a gentle arc. It is a spike on a graph, steep on both sides with a brief glittering peak in the middle where the real money is made and lost. For several years, what came out of the ground in Tombstone was extraordinary. The silver ore was rich, the mining companies were profitable, and the money flowed through the town in quantities that supported a social and commercial life of remarkable sophistication for a desert settlement of its age. The stamp mills that reduced ore to processable material ran around the clock, their rhythmic pounding a constant background sound that Tombstone residents described as so thoroughly integrated into daily life that they noticed its absence more than its presence. Wells Fargo shipments of silver bullion departed the town regularly, heavily guarded, their value reflecting the output of mines that were producing at levels that justified the most optimistic assessments of the original investors. The capital that came with mining prosperity built the tombstone that the mythology celebrates. The Crystal Palace, the Oriental, the Birdcage Theatre, the courthouse, the banks and hotels and restaurants that gave a desert mining camp the social texture of a genuine city. All of this required money, and the money required silver, and the silver required mines that continued to produce at the depth and volume that the early years had established as the baseline expectation. But the mines went deeper as the surface and near-surface ore was extracted, and deeper mines encountered a problem that has plagued miners throughout the entire history of the profession. from the copper mines of ancient Cyprus to the gold mines of 19th century California to the silver mines of the Tombstone Plateau, water. The aquifer beneath the Tombstone Plateau sat at a depth that the early mines did not reach. In the first years of the boom, the shafts did not go deep enough to encounter it, and the miners worked in conditions that were difficult by any reasonable standard, but that did not include the particularly demoralizing experience of watching water rise faster than you can remove it. As the shafts were sunk lower in pursuit of the rich ore that the geological survey suggested lay at depth, they began to encounter the water table, and the encounter was not a pleasant one. At first this was manageable, or at least the people managing it told themselves it was. Pumps were installed, because pump technology by the 1880s was reasonably well developed, and the water was controlled, though at significant and rising expense. The operating costs of the mines began climbing as pumping became a constant requirement, rather than an occasional one. The ore being extracted was still rich enough to justify these costs, but the margin was narrowing, and narrowing margins make investors nervous in the way that only money can make people nervous. The warning shot came in May of 1881, which is worth noting is the same year as the Corral gunfight, because sometimes history likes to pile everything into the same moment to see how people handle it. The pumps at the Grand Central Mine failed. This was not a minor equipment malfunction. It was a cascading disaster of exactly the type that mining engineers have nightmares about. The water rose rapidly through the connected mine workings, flooding chambers and shafts and galleries that represented years of labour and millions of dollars of investment. The underground geography of the mine system meant that water did not stay where it entered. It moved through passages and connections into adjacent workings, spreading the damage horizontally as well as vertically. Emergency measures were taken with the urgency that the situation demanded. New pumps were ordered from manufacturers in the east, at considerable expense and with the considerable delay that shipping heavy industrial equipment to a desert mining town in 1881 involved. Men worked around the clock trying to manage what could be managed while the machinery was in transit. The water was eventually brought back under control, and the mines resumed operation. But the episode was a warning delivered in the most emphatic possible terms. The mines were increasingly dependent on mechanical systems that could fail, and when they failed, the consequences were immediate and severe. The town of Tombstone was meanwhile absorbing its own disasters, separate from but related to the mining situation. Fire was the constant threat of the frontier town built primarily of wood in a hot, dry climate, where any spark could become catastrophic given the right wind conditions. Tombstone learned this repeatedly and expensively. The first major fire struck in June of 1881, consuming a significant portion of Allen Street, including several major saloons and businesses that formed the commercial heart of the boomtown. The speed and thoroughness with which Tombstone rebuilt after this disaster was genuinely impressive, and reflected the energy and capital that the silver prosperity had generated. Construction began within days. Destroyed buildings were replaced within months. The town demonstrated a resilience that seemed to justify its eventual motto. But the second fire, arriving in May of 1882, was a more punishing blow. This one destroyed an estimated 66 businesses and caused damage that contemporary accounts put at several $100,000. Which was an enormous sum by the standards of 1882, and by the standards of a town whose economic foundation was already showing signs of erosion. The fires were not merely economic setbacks in the narrow accounting sense. They destroyed records that could not be replaced, reduced the physical stock of buildings to rubble that required capital to rebuild, and imposed costs on businesses that were simultaneously absorbing the impacts of rising mining costs and the general disruption that the political conflicts of the Earp era had introduced into the town's commercial atmosphere. Some business owners who had summoned the will and the capital to rebuild after the first fire simply looked at the smoking ruins of the second and made a different calculation. They did not rebuild. They took whatever was salvageable and they moved on. This was the beginning of something that would accelerate over the following years, a slow drain of capital and confidence and human energy away from Tombstone toward other opportunities in other places. The 1880s were a decade of struggle for the town, interspersed with the political and violent dramas that have received all the historical attention, but that were unfolding within an economic context that was growing steadily more precarious. Mining continued. The ore was still there, but reaching it was becoming more expensive, and the margin between what it cost to extract the silver and what the silver was worth on the market was narrowing in uncomfortable ways. Then came 1886. The pumps in the major mines failed again, and this time the failure was not a temporary mechanical breakdown but a defeat. The underground water flooded the lower levels of the main mines in a way that the available technology could not address at economically viable cost. The rich ore that had driven Tombstone's growth was not exhausted in any geological sense. It was simply underwater, and reaching it would require capital investments in pumping infrastructure that no one was willing to make, given the uncertainty of the returns and the direction in which the price of silver was moving on the international commodity markets. Silver prices had been declining throughout the 1880s as global supply increased, and as the monetary politics of the major economies began moving away from the bimetallic standard that had supported silver's value. The trend was visible, and it was not encouraging for silver mining operations that were already operating with reduced margins. Investors in the Tombstone mines, who had made significant money in the boom years, but who were now looking at rising costs and declining prices and flooded mine workings, began making the rational calculation that additional investment was not justified. The silver panic of 1893 was the final economic blow, though by that point Tombstone had been declining for years, and the blow was more confirmation than revelation. The price of silver collapsed as the United States moved decisively toward the gold standard, removing the legislative support that had maintained a floor under silver prices. Mining communities across the American West, not just Tombstone, faced the same crisis simultaneously, and the same response played out in all of them. The mines closed or reduced operations to skeleton crews. The workers left. The businesses that had served the workers left. The infrastructure that had served the businesses fell into disuse and then disrepair. The population of Tombstone responded the way populations always respond to the disappearance of economic opportunity, which is to say they left. Not dramatically, not in a single mass exodus that you could photograph or describe in a single news story. The departure was gradual and personal and quiet, family by family, business by business, month by month. A merchant who could not pay rent on his storefront did not make an announcement about the decline of Tombstone. He simply packed up and moved to wherever there was work. A hotel that could no longer fill its rooms did not throw a closing ceremony. The proprietor quietly stopped taking reservations, and eventually the building sat empty. The Birdcage Theatre shuttered. The Tombstone Epitaph reduced its operations to a skeleton. The saloons that had run around the clock at the height of the boom closed or reduced to serving the diminished local population, rather than the thousands of miners and merchants and gamblers and visitors who had made Allen Street a genuine commercial spectacle. The stamp mills fell silent, and the silence they left behind was the loudest thing in Tombstone for years. By the mid-1890s, the transformation was essentially complete. Tombstone had declined from a city of somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people at its peak to a village of perhaps 500 permanent residents, a reduction of more than 90% in perhaps 15 years. The buildings stood, many of them, because adobe and brick resist the desert wind better than wood and canvas, and because some of the construction of the boom years had been done with genuine quality. But they stood increasingly empty, their windows dark, their interiors accumulating the particular dusty silence of spaces that were built for human density, and now contain only air. The Cochise County seat, which had been located in Tombstone because Tombstone had been the most important place in the county during the boom years, was moved to Bisbee in 1899. Bisbee, to the south, had its own copper mining economy that was proving more durable than Tombstone's silver. The loss of the county seat was both a recognition of Tombstone's decline and a practical acceleration of it, since the government offices and the lawyers and the court activity that had accompanied county government moved with the seat. What remained was the landscape, which had always been there, and which the human drama had not changed in any fundamental way. The Dragoon Mountains still stood to the northeast, their rock formations catching the morning light in colours that no amount of human turbulence had altered. The San Pedro River still ran its seasonal course through the valley below, fed by the mountain snowpack and the summer monsoons as it had been for millennia, before anyone decided to name the nearest town after a miner's joke. The sky over southern Arizona was still that particular shade of blue that seems unique to the desert southwest, a blue so saturated and so deep that it creates a kind of vertigo, a feeling of standing at the edge of something vast. And beneath the ground, the silver was still there, flooded and inaccessible and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the town above it, to the gunfights and the trials and the vendetta rides and the newspaper battles and the political feuds and the fires and the economic collapse. The silver did not care about any of it. It had been there long before Ed Schieffelin arrived with his geological instincts and his stubbornness, and it would remain there long after the last tourist had taken the last photograph of the Boot Hill grave markers. Tombstone had not died. Quite. The town too tough to die was indeed proving its motto in the most minimal technical sense. There were still people there, still a post office and a school and a church or two, and the skeleton of civic life. There was still the Tombstone epitaph, still publishing with the particular institutional stubbornness that some newspapers develop when they have survived enough adversity. But it was a shadow version of what had been, a desert community of modest and reduced ambitions where the main industry was no longer silver extraction, but something harder to quantify and harder to profit from. The industry was memory. The product was the past. And for that particular industry, Tombstone had raw material in quantities that would eventually prove inexhaustible. It simply had not figured that out yet. The survivors and their stories. What happened to everyone. When the smoke cleared, metaphorically and sometimes literally, the people who had made Tombstone's story had scattered across the American West, and the years that followed, living out the remainder of their lives in ways that range from quietly ordinary to repeatedly extraordinary. Wyatt Earp's post-Tombstone life is one of the most remarkable extended epilogues in American biographical history. He lived until January 13th, 1929, which meant that he survived until almost the beginning of the Great Depression, long enough to see automobiles become common, to see airplanes, to see the movies that would eventually tell his story. He was 80 years old when he died, having outlived virtually every other figure of significance from the Tombstone drama by decades. After leaving Arizona in 1882, Wyatt did not settle quietly into retirement. He operated saloons, he gambled professionally, he ran a horse racing circuit, he went to Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898, he ran saloons in Nome and in other boom communities. He tried his hand at various enterprises with his characteristic combination of shrewdness and occasional miscalculation. He spent time in California, in Nevada, in various places where frontier opportunity still existed in some form. His relationship with Josephine Marcus, who had become his companion after leaving Bayonne, was the defining personal relationship of his adult life. Josephine, known as Sadie in their private life, was a vivid and strong-willed woman who proved as durable as Wyatt himself. She survived him and died in 1944. Their marriage, never formalized in the legal record in any way that historians have been able to conclusively establish, was by the accounts of those who knew them a genuine partnership of mutual devotion that lasted nearly 50 years. Wyatt became interested in his own legend in the 1920s as the Western mythology industry developed, and various journalists and writers began approaching him for his story. He cooperated with a writer named Stuart Lake on a biography that would be published shortly after his death in 1931. Lake was not exactly a dispassionate chronicler, and Wyatt was not exactly an objective source, and the result was a book that dramatically shaped the public's understanding of the Tombstone story, while taking significant liberties with the historical record. Virgil Earp recovered from his terrible wounds to a degree that impressed the physicians who treated him, though he never regained full use of his damaged arm. He and Allie, his wife, eventually settled in Colton, California, and later Virgil worked as a lawman in Prescott, Arizona and in Nevada. He died in October of 1905 in Goldfield, Nevada, where he had been working as a lawman in yet another mining boomtown. He was 62 years old. Allie Earp survived him by many decades, dying in 1947. Her memoir, compiled from conversations with the historian Frank Waters, provides a perspective on the Tombstone years that is sometimes sharp and sometimes affecting in its record of what the Earp women experienced. Morgan Earp, of course, did not have a post-Tombstone life. He was buried in Colton, California, near his family's home base. He was 29 years old. Doc Holliday's story after Tombstone was the saddest of the survivors, which, given the competition, is saying something. He went to Colorado with Wyatt after the Vendetta ride, and there he continued his career as a professional gambler in various Colorado mining towns, Leadville, and then Glenwood Springs. His tuberculosis, which had been consuming him for years, accelerated. He died in a sanitarium in Glenwood Springs in November of 1887, reportedly of tuberculosis, with the complications that the disease brought in its final stages. He was 36 years old. There is a story, possibly embellished but too good not to mention, that his last words were something to the effect of "This is funny," reflecting on the fact that he had always expected to die with his boots on, in violence rather than in bed. Whether he actually said it or not, it captures something true about him. John Behan continued in Arizona political life for some years after Tombstone, serving in various appointed positions with varying success. He worked as a prison official in Arizona for a period, which is an irony rich enough to satisfy any storyteller. He eventually faded from public life and died in Tucson in 1912. He was 67 years old. The historical literature has not been kind to him, and the unkindness is probably not entirely unfair, though it should be acknowledged that most of what we know about Bayon comes from sources that were not exactly sympathetic. Big Nose Kate, Doc Holliday's tumultuous companion, outlived nearly everyone, dying in Arizona in 1940 at the age of 90, having spent her later years in the Arizona Pioneers' home in Prescott. She gave interviews in her old age that provided valuable, if sometimes unreliable, information about Doc's life. She seems to have viewed her years with Doc as the central experience of her life, regardless of how complicated that experience had been. Ike Clanton, as mentioned, met his end in 1887 when he was shot by a detective who had been investigating cattle theft. The investigation had established that Ike was still engaged in his family's traditional business, and the confrontation that resulted was fatal for Ike. He was approximately 40 years old. The McClory brothers and Billy Clanton were in the Boot Hill Cemetery, where they had been since October of 1881. Their graves became, eventually, tourist attractions, which is an afterlife they probably did not anticipate. Josephine Earp, Wyatt's companion and eventual widow, lived until 1944, spending much of her later life in a campaign to manage Wyatt's legacy, and to ensure that his story was told in the most favourable possible terms. She was protective, sometimes obstructive, and clearly driven by genuine love for the man she had spent 50 years with. She died in Los Angeles, and the town itself, Tombstone, survived in its diminished form through the early decades of the 20th century, waiting for the next development that would define its existence. How the legend was born. From history to mythology. The transformation of Tombstone from a failed mining town into an American myth was not a sudden event. It was a gradual process that unfolded over decades, fed by many tributaries of storytelling and popular memory, each one adding to the accumulating legend in ways both faithful and fanciful. By the time the story was fully mythologized, the relationship between what had actually happened and what people believed had happened was complex enough to require a historian's careful navigation. The earliest layer of the mythology was created almost in real time by the dime novels and sensational newspaper accounts that followed the events of 1881 and 1882. The dime novel industry was the mass entertainment medium of its era, producing cheap, luridly covered paperback stories about frontier violence and adventure that sold by the millions to an audience hungry for escapism and excitement. The events in Tombstone were exactly the kind of material that dime novel writers fed upon, and stories drawing on the gunfight at the OK Corral appeared within years, sometimes months, of the actual events. These early fictional treatments were not careful about accuracy. They were not supposed to be. They were supposed to be exciting, and they achieved that goal by simplifying, dramatizing, and outright inventing as needed. The Earps appeared in these stories as straightforward heroes, the cowboys as straightforward villains, and the complexity that characterized the actual situation was cheerfully discarded in service of a narrative that the audience could follow without difficulty. The actual participants in the Tombstone drama were still alive during these years, many of them, and some of them had opinions about how their stories were being told. Wyatt Earp in particular was aware of the growing mythology around his name and had a complicated relationship with it. He valued his reputation and was concerned about how history would remember him, but he was not always in control of the narrative, and various versions of his story circulated in the popular press without his participation or approval. The development of the Western as a distinct literary genre in the late 19th and early 20th century provided the framework into which the Tombstone story was placed, and where it found its most enduring home. Zane Grey, Owen Wister, and other writers established the conventions of the Western as a form, conventions involving the lone hero, the lawless frontier, the confrontation between civilization and savagery, the power of personal courage and moral clarity. These were not invented for the Tombstone story, but the Tombstone story fit them remarkably well, which is part of why the story attached itself so tenaciously to the genre. The key document in the construction of the Wyatt Earp myth is Stuart Lake's biography, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, published in 1931, 2 years after Earp's death. Lake had interviewed Earp extensively in the late 1920s and had access to Josephine Earp's recollections and cooperation, at least initially, though the relationship between Lake and the widow became complicated when Josephine realized the extent to which Lake was shaping the story in directions she did not entirely control. Lake's book was, by the standards of popular biography of its era, a well-crafted and absorbing read. It was also, by the standards of historical accuracy, deeply problematic. Lake invented conversations, dramatized events for which he had no eyewitness sources, and consistently presented Wyatt in the most heroic possible light while downplaying or ignoring inconvenient facts. He created the version of Wyatt Earp that most people know, the steely-eyed lawman who brings order to a lawless town through moral courage and quick reflexes, and that version became so dominant in the popular imagination that it has been difficult to dislodge even by decades of more careful historical work. The radio programs of the 1930s and 1940s, which broadcast Western adventure stories to millions of American homes, further cemented the mythology. Wyatt Earp, along with figures like Bat Masterson and Wild Bill Hickok, became household names for generations of Americans who grew up with serialized frontier adventures as their entertainment. The stories told on the radio were not trying to be history. They were trying to be entertainment, but they implanted the Western mythology so deeply into American cultural consciousness that it became genuinely difficult to separate the myth from whatever lay beneath it. Television accelerated this process dramatically. The television Western was the dominant genre of American network television in the 1950s and 60s, and the life and legend of Wyatt Earp, which premiered in 1955 and ran for 6 seasons, was among the first adult Western dramas on American television. It was enormously popular, reached tens of millions of viewers weekly, and presented a Wyatt Earp who was simultaneously more dignified than the dime novel version and no closer to the historical complexity of the actual man. What the legend required in all its forms was a moral framework clear enough to be satisfying. The actual Tombstone story, with its Republicans and Democrats, its town commerce and rural cattle economy, its complicated law enforcement jurisdictions and its personal animosities wrapped in political conflicts, was too tangled and too ambiguous to serve directly as myth. The myth needed heroes and villains, it needed a clear moral dimension to the violence, and it needed an ending that felt like justice rather than like the messy, unresolved departure from Arizona of a man facing murder charges. The myth provided all of these things by creative selection and rearrangement of what history offered. And the history offered enough raw material, genuinely dramatic incidents, genuinely compelling characters, genuine violence with genuine consequences, that the creative selection did not have to work too hard to find its story. By the time Wyatt Earp died in 1929, the legend was well established. What followed his death was the legend's formalization into permanent cultural artifact. Hollywood and Tombstone, the films that shaped the legend. The cinema found Tombstone early and never let it go. The story of a gunfight, of good men against bad men, of law against lawlessness, in a visually spectacular desert landscape, was exactly the kind of material that the movies were designed to tell, and from the silent era through the present day, Tombstone and its characters have returned to the screen with a regularity that suggests the story meets some ongoing need in the audience's imagination. The earliest film treatments appeared in the silent era, when Western subjects were among the most popular material for a medium that could not yet use spoken dialogue, and therefore relied heavily on visual action and iconic imagery. Frontier gunslingers translated beautifully to the silent screen. You did not need words to understand what a drawn pistol meant. The 1930s, 40s, and 50s produced multiple Western films that touched on the Tombstone story, some directly and some tangentially. My Darling Clementine, directed by John Ford and released in 1946, was one of the most artistically significant treatments. Henry Fonda played Wyatt Earp with a quiet, reflective dignity that was entirely Ford's interpretation and only loosely connected to the historical record. Ford was not interested in biography. He was interested in the American landscape and what the people who moved through it represented. My Darling Clementine is beautiful, is melancholy, is shot in Monument Valley with the grandeur that Ford brought to everything he made there, and it has essentially nothing to do with the actual events of Tombstone 1881. It is a dream of those events, and as a dream it is deeply affecting. Gunfight at the OK Corral, released in 1957, starred Burt Lancaster as Wyatt Earp and Kirk Douglas as Doc Holliday. This film leaned into the personal friendship between the two men as its central emotional focus, and the chemistry between Lancaster and Douglas, both enormously charismatic performers, carried the film through its departures from historical accuracy. Kirk Douglas's Doc Holliday in particular established an image of the character as mordantly witty, physically wasted, and romantically tragic that would influence all subsequent portrayals. The television series The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, running from 1955 to 1961, starred Hugh O'Brien in the title role and introduced the story to an enormous weekly television audience. O'Brien's Wyatt was a straightforward hero in the Western television tradition, upright and morally clear in a way that reflected the values the genre was expected to embody in mid-century America. The show dealt with many of the same events that define the Tombstone story, but with the kind of creative latitude that 6 seasons of weekly television demands when the actual historical source material runs to a few years of relatively concentrated events. Then came 1993, and the film simply titled Tombstone. George P. Cosmatos directed it, though the creative force behind the production was significant in other quarters, including Kurt Russell, who played Wyatt Earp, and Val Kilmer, who played Doc Holliday in a performance that is genuinely one of the finest pieces of character work in the history of the Western genre. Kilmer's Doc is simultaneously terrifying and heartbreaking, a man burning from the inside out who has made peace with his own consumption by becoming absolutely dangerous. The famous line, "I'm your huckleberry," delivered with that particular drawl and that particular cold smile, became one of the most quoted movie lines of the 1990s. Tombstone was not critically adored when it was released, receiving reviews that range from mixed to appreciative but not ecstatic. But audiences loved it, with an intensity that persisted and grew over the years. It became a genuine cult film, the kind that people quote comprehensively and watch repeatedly. And its version of the Tombstone story, while historically approximate at best, captured something emotionally true about the characters and their relationships. The friendship between Wyatt and Doc, the family loyalty of the Earps, the romanticism of the vendetta ride, these elements resonated. In the same year, 1993, Lawrence Kasdan directed Wyatt Earp, with Kevin Costner in the title role. This film took a longer, more chronological approach to Earp's life, beginning with his youth and working through the Tombstone events to his later years. It was more ambitious in scope than Tombstone and arguably more historically accurate in certain respects, but it was also considerably less fun, and audiences responded accordingly. It is a serious film, sometimes a very good film, but it lost the comparison to Tombstone that the simultaneous release made inevitable. The pattern of Hollywood Tombstone tells us something interesting about what audiences want from this particular story. The films that succeed tend to be the ones that lean into the emotional and dramatic dimensions of the material, the friendship and loyalty, the moral clarity that the myth insists was present, even when the history suggests more ambiguity. The films that take a more measured or complex approach tend to be more admired than enjoyed. There is something in the Tombstone story that people want to feel rather than think about, at least in their first encounter with it. The thinking comes later. And the films have kept coming. Documentaries, miniseries, television dramas, revisionist treatments, all have returned to this particular well in the decades since 1993. The story appears to be inexhaustible, or at least the audience's appetite for new versions of it appears to be. The town today, Tombstone preserved, performed and remembered. If you drive south from Tucson on Interstate 10 and then turn southeast on State Route 80, you will eventually arrive in Tombstone, Arizona, a town of approximately 1,200 permanent residents that receives somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 visitors per year. The disproportion between the permanent population and the visitor count tells you everything you need to know about what Tombstone is in the 21st century. It is a museum that people live in, or perhaps more accurately, it is a performance that some people have chosen to make their home. Allen Street, the main commercial thoroughfare that hosted the Crystal Palace and the Oriental, and all the other saloons and businesses of the Boomtown era, has been preserved and restored, and in some cases recreated in a form that is partially historical and partially theatrical. The street is closed to automobile traffic for most of its length, which allows visitors to walk its length without the anachronism of parked cars, and the buildings that line it have been adapted to the tourist economy in ways that maintain at least a visual connection to the 1880s while housing gift shops, restaurants, and entertainment venues. The gunfight reenactments are the most famous feature of modern Tombstone, performed multiple times daily at the OK Corral tourist site and at various other locations around town. The reenactors are costume performers who have studied the events of October 26, 1881 in considerable detail, and who perform scripted versions of the gunfight for audiences that range from deeply knowledgeable history enthusiasts to families from the Midwest who simply want to see people with guns and cowboys. The performances vary in historical accuracy and in entertainment value, but they serve the purpose of making the story vivid and immediate for visitors who might otherwise struggle to connect a historical marker and some adobe walls with something that actually happened to real people. The OK Corral itself is now a tourist attraction operated under that name, though the actual historical gunfight did not take place in the corral itself, but in the vacant lot adjacent to it on Fremont Street. This geographical imprecision has been maintained for 100 years, because the OK Corral is a much better name for marketing purposes than the vacant lot near Fremont Street. History and marketing have a complicated relationship in Tombstone, and marketing has won most of the disputes. The Birdcage Theatre is one of the most compelling and authentic historical sites in the town. It has been preserved essentially as it was when it operated in the 1880s, complete with the bullet holes in the ceiling and walls that have been counted and remarked upon by every writer who has visited the place. It was closed as an operating business in 1889 and essentially sealed, which means that its interior contains an extraordinary archaeological record of what the venue looked like and contained during its operational years. Visitors can see the suspended box seats, the stage, the bars and gaming tables, and the overall architecture of the space, which communicates something real about what the entertainment of the Tombstone era was like, in a way that a reconstruction or a museum display cannot quite replicate. The Tombstone Epitaph, the newspaper founded by John Clum in 1880, still publishes. It is now a monthly paper serving the tourist and historical interest community, rather than a daily paper of record for a thriving mining community, but its continuous publication from 1880 to the present represents a remarkable institutional continuity. Back issues from the 1880s are preserved and accessible, and they remain one of the most important primary sources for historians studying the Tombstone period. Boot Hill Cemetery sits on a low hill at the edge of town and contains the graves of many of the people who died in and around Tombstone during the boomtown years. The McClory brothers and Billy Clanton are buried there, in a grave that has become probably the most photographed grave marker in Arizona. The wooden markers that originally identified the graves were replaced long ago, and the cemetery has been maintained as a historical site, though it has also been thoroughly touristed in a way that gives it a slightly performative quality when you visit. There is a gift shop. The county courthouse, built in 1882 as the seat of Cochise County government, has been preserved as a state historic park. It is one of the finest surviving examples of Victorian courthouse architecture in the American Southwest, and its interior contains an important collection of artifacts and documents relating to Tombstone's history. The courtroom where various legal proceedings of the Tombstone era were conducted, including some related to the OK Corral aftermath, is preserved with its original furnishings. The relationship between historical accuracy and tourist appeal in modern Tombstone is a genuinely interesting and somewhat unresolved tension. The town needs tourism to survive economically, and tourism is driven substantially by the mythology, which means there is a structural incentive to give visitors the version of the story they expect, rather than the version that the historical record supports. At the same time, Tombstone has a community of residents and historical preservationists who are deeply interested in accuracy and who have done significant work to complicate and enrich the simple narrative that most visitors arrive with. The result is a place that contains, if you look for it, both the mythology and the history, sometimes in the same building, sometimes on the same page of the same brochure. You can spend a day in Tombstone watching gunfight reenactors and buying postcards, or you can spend a day in Tombstone talking to the people who run the Historical Society and reading the microfilm copies of the Tombstone Epitaph and thinking carefully about what actually happened and why. Both experiences are available and both are valuable in their different ways. What Tombstone really means. The legacy of the Wild West. We have travelled a long way to arrive at this question. From the Hohokam Canals to the Apache Wars, from Ed Schieffelin's Silver Strike to the gunfight in the vacant lot, from the Vendetta ride to the Hollywood films to the modern tourist town with its reenactors and its bullet-riddled birdcage ceiling. And now it is worth asking the question that underlies all of it, which is not simply what happened in Tombstone in 1881, but why we cannot stop talking about it, because we genuinely cannot stop. The story has been told in every possible medium, has been analysed by historians and celebrated by mythmakers, and disputed by partisans and romanticised by filmmakers, and commodified by the tourist industry, and reconsidered by every generation since it happened. And it has survived all of this treatment with its essential fascination intact. That staying power is not accidental. It tells us something important about the story and, more importantly, about ourselves. Part of what Tombstone represents in the American imagination is the frontier itself, that particular chapter of American experience when the continent was being integrated into a national economic and political system, and when the integration was, frequently, violent and contested and morally complicated. The frontier, as Americans have mythologized it, is a space where individual agency matters supremely, where a person's character and courage determine outcomes in a way that the more settled and institutionalized world of ordinary life does not permit. Wyatt Earp, with his pistol and his moral code, is the expression of this mythology, a man who can cut through complexity with physical action and personal will in a way that most of us in our ordinary lives cannot. This mythology has a political dimension that is worth acknowledging. The Western hero, in his most basic form, represents a particular vision of American values: individualism, self-reliance, the primacy of personal honor over institutional authority, the willingness to use violence in service of justice when the institutions of law are inadequate or corrupt. These are values that resonate differently with different parts of the American political spectrum, and the Western has always been, among other things, a political statement, sometimes a deliberately conservative one, and sometimes a more complicated meditation on the costs and contradictions of those values. The Tombstone story is particularly interesting in this regard because it contains, beneath its mythological surface, enough historical complexity to challenge the simple framework that the myth imposes. Wyatt Earp was not simply a lawman bringing justice to a lawless town. He was a man with economic interests in the gambling trade, political interests in the county sheriff's race, personal animosities toward his opponents, and a habit of pistol-whipping people before the famous gunfight. The cowboys were not simply villains. They were participants in an economic system that the rural community supported, and they had genuine political legitimacy in a substantial portion of the county's population. The gunfight itself was not a clear-cut confrontation between law and lawlessness. It was the violent expression of a political conflict that had as much to do with county politics and personal rivalries as it did with any principle of justice. This complexity, which historians have worked to uncover and communicate for decades, does not make Tombstone less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because it allows the story to be read as something more than a morality play. It can be read as a case study in how communities handle the tension between order and freedom, between the needs of commerce and the customs of the open range, between institutional authority and personal codes of conduct. These tensions are not peculiar to 1881. They are present in every community, every society, every moment of human organization, and the Tombstone drama stages them in particularly vivid and consequential form. There is also a geographic dimension to the Tombstone story that deserves acknowledgement. The landscape of southern Arizona is itself a character in the narrative, not merely a backdrop. The desert imposes conditions on human activity that shape behavior, culture, and possibility. The harshness of the environment, the requirement of constant resource management, the isolation from other centers of civilization, the beauty that exists alongside the danger, these qualities create a context within which human drama plays out differently than it does in softer landscapes. The legend of the Wild West is inseparable from the landscape of the West, from the specific visual and physical experience of that place, and what it demands of the people who inhabit it. The Chiricahua Apache, whose homeland the Tombstone story occupies, are rarely centered in the mythology of the place, and this absence is itself significant. The full story of what happened in southern Arizona in the 1870s and 80s includes the dispossession and exile of a people who had lived in that landscape for generations, and that story is not a comfortable addition to the mythology of frontier heroism. But it is part of the truth of what happened there, and any honest engagement with the Tombstone legacy requires acknowledging it. What does the legacy of Tombstone mean for the 21st century? It means, among other things, that we are still working out the question that the town dramatized so vividly in 1881, which is the question of how a community handles the tension between different conceptions of order, different definitions of legitimacy, different claims to authority over the same territory and the same people. The Earps said they represented law. The cowboy said they represented the customs and economics of the open range. Behan said he represented the democratic will of the county. Each claim had some validity. None of them was absolute. We like to think that we live in a world where these questions have been settled, where institutional authority is clear and legitimate and administered fairly. The Tombstone story, in its historical complexity rather than its mythological simplicity, reminds us that these questions are never finally settled. that every community and every generation has to work out the balance for itself, and that the working out is rarely clean and rarely without cost. The 30 seconds of gunfire on October 26, 1881 echo, as we noted at the beginning of this journey, because they were loud, because they happened to the right people in the right place at the right time, and because the story they embodied touched something deep and durable in the American self-understanding. They echo because we made them echo by telling and retelling the story until it became something larger than itself. And we keep telling the story because the questions it raises are questions we are still living with. The dust settles, and so we come at last to the end of the trail. Or perhaps not the end exactly, because a story like Tombstone's does not really end. It simply moves into a quieter register. The way the sound of the San Pedro River becomes background rather than foreground when you have been standing beside it long enough. The town is still there. Go south from Tucson on a clear Arizona morning, and the drive will take you through the kind of landscape that makes people understand why human beings have always been drawn to the desert. The austere beauty of it, the cleanness of a sky that contains nothing between you and the blue, the ancient geological patience of the hills that rise from the flat desert floor, in colours that shift through the day from brown to red to purple as the light changes. The saguaro cactus stand along the roadsides like figures from another time, arms raised in what might be greeting or might be surrender, or might be simply the particular posture that a cactus has decided suits it. They have been doing this for a very long time and they are in no hurry. Tombstone itself sits on its plateau in the late afternoon light and looks, from a distance, like what it is, a small town in the desert that the desert has decided to tolerate. The buildings are there, the ones that survived the fires and the floods and the slow attrition of a century and more of desert weather. The courthouse is there, the bird cage is there, the street is there where Ed Schieffelin's joke of a name became a city's name and then an American legend. If you stand on Allen Street in the late afternoon when the tourist traffic has thinned and the light is going golden over the Dragon Mountains to the east, you can almost hear the absent sounds. The stamp mills that operated around the clock when the silver was coming out of the ground, the piano from the Oriental, the particular quality of noise that a town full of people living at high intensity makes, a quality of aliveness that is different from the quieter sounds of a town living normally within its means. You cannot quite hear them, but you can feel their absence, which is its own kind of presence. Wyatt Earp died in a house in Los Angeles in 1929, an old man in a city that was becoming the centre of an industry that would tell his story for the next century. He had lived long enough to see the automobile replace the horse, long enough to see the silent films that had already begun mythologizing the world he'd inhabited, long enough to understand that what he had been part of had become something larger than itself. Whether he would have recognized himself in the mythology is uncertain. He had complicated feelings about his own reputation, as people who have been mythologized during their lifetimes tend to do. The Wyatt Earp of the legend is cleaner than the Wyatt Earp of history, more purely heroic, less encumbered by the economic and political interests that gave the actual man's conduct its moral ambiguity. Whether the real Wyatt would have preferred the legend's version of himself, or whether he would have found it irritatingly reductive, is something only he could have answered. Doc Holliday is buried in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, in a cemetery on a hill above the town where the waters of the Roaring Fork and the Colorado meet. His grave marker says he died in bed, which for a man of his reputation and his willingness to court violent death was both ironic and, in a strange way, triumphant. He had outlived the tuberculosis' schedule for him by years. He had outlived several men who had tried to kill him. He had been, in the events of 1881, the most dangerous person in a room full of dangerous people, and he died in bed, which is not the worst thing. The desert around Tombstone does not remember anything, of course. Deserts do not have memories. They have patience and indifference, and the slow, geological time that makes human dramas seem brief and small. The silver is still down there, beneath the flooded levels of the old mines, as indifferent to everything that happened above it as it was on the day Ed Schieffelin found the first outcropping and named it with a dead man's punchline. The Ocotillo blooms red in spring, and the monsoon comes in summer, and the sky turns those incredible colours at sunset that no camera has ever quite managed to capture, and the town sits on its plateau and continues to be Tombstone. The town too tough to die, performing its own history for those who come to see it, preserving what it can of what was real, and accepting that some of what is preserved is the legend rather than the truth. Both matter. The truth matters because it is what actually happened to real people, whose lives were more complicated and more interesting than the mythology allows. The legend matters because it is what we made of their story, and what we make of stories tells us something about who we are and what we value and what we fear and what we hope for. The guns are quiet now, have been quiet for a very long time. The dust has settled on Fremont Street, and the afternoon of October 26, 1881 is as far away as the hills. Now let the story settle with you into the quieter parts of your mind. Let the gunfire become distant, a rumble beyond the horizon, fading. Let the voices of the saloons fade into the desert air. Let Wyatt and Doc and Virgil and the McClorys and the Clantons and all the rest of them recede into the particular silence that belongs to people whose stories have been told and retold until the telling itself becomes a kind of peace. The desert is patient. The night is long. The stars over southern Arizona are extraordinary, so many of them and so bright in the absence of city light. The same stars that the Chiricahua looked up at from their camps in the Dragoon Mountains, that Ed Schieffelin looked up at during his cold, careful nights alone in the hills before he found his silver, that Wyatt Earp looked up at from the street of a town that bore a dead man's joke for a name. The same stars still there, still watching everything unfold below them with the celestial indifference of things that have seen it all before and will see it all again. Let your breath slow now. Let the story breathe itself out, the last of it, like smoke from a fire that has burned down to coals and then to ash and then to nothing. The town is quiet. The mines are flooded. The birdcage is empty. The guns are holstered and the hands that held them are dust. There is only the desert now, and the stars and the dark behind them, and the silence, which in the desert is never quite silence but is rather the very quiet sound of everything that remains after the story is over. Sleep well. The town too tough to die will be here when you wake.